Hi, friends. Father Kerry Walters here, pastor of Holy Spirit American National Catholic Church. And this is another Holy Spirit moment, this one on the one thing atheists get right: God doesn't exist. I'd like to share with you a passage from one of Thomas Merton's letters. Merton, of course, was the 20th century Cistercian contemplative and thinker who has so influenced the American religious scene. In this letter, written to a young Hindu, Merton says this: Atheists take the true and deep concept of God and regard it in a light in which it is false and debased. They think that religious people believe in a God who is simply a being among other beings, part of a series of beings, an object which can be discovered and demonstrated. This, of course, is a false notion of God, the absolute, the source and origin of all being, beyond all beings, and transcending them all, and hence not to be sought as one among them. It is not hard to disprove that God exists as a being among beings, but this is no menace to religion. I think that Merton is absolutely right, and of course he's not the only Christian who has said that. Throughout the ages, Christians have insisted that the wrong way to think about God is to see God as an existing object in the world among other objects. You know, words have a meaning, and we use words frequently having forgotten the deep, deep meaning that words have within them. The philosopher Martin Heidegger in the 20th century warned us that to forget the meaning of words is to forget in large part who we are and who the world is. So I think that it's important to think about what the word existence actually means and why it doesn't apply to God. Atheists are right. You can't demonstrate the existence of God because God doesn't exist. But you need to know what the word existence means. The word existence comes from the Latin existere, which means to come into being or to become. Now, whatever else God is not something that becomes, because everything that becomes belongs to the spatial temporal order. God, by definition, does not belong to the spatial temporal order. God does not, therefore, exist in the way that things within the temporal and spatial order exist. And what that means as well is that God is not an object. Obicere is the Latin from whence we derive the word object, and it means to throw in the way of. An object is something that is thrown in our way. It gets in our way. It is a thing in our field of vision or in our field of movement. It is limited, it is spatial, and it is temporal. So once again, objects exist because they are spatial and temporal, and they are finite, they are limited, but what can be said of an object and its existence simply cannot be predicated of God. Now please note, it's not even necessary that you believe in God to accept this distinction. Whatever else the word God means, it cannot, ought not to mean just another object in the world. If we claim that, then we're using language sloppily. We're abusing, we're manhandling the very meaning of the word existence and the very meaning of the word object and the very meaning of the word God. And yet atheists will act again and again and again as if God is nothing more than an object in the world, in a series of beings, in a world of beings. So, for example, you'll find Bertrand Russell arguing that God is analogous to a flying teapot, a teapot circumambulating in outer space, which of course is an attempt on his part to show that the notion of God is absurd, but in point of fact it's a misanalogy because a teapot, even Russell's teapot, exists in space and time. It is a thing among things. or the later incarnation of Russell's teapot, the so-called flying spaghetti monster, again is intended as a reductio ad absurdum on the idea of God, but it's a complete misanalogy because the flying spaghetti monster, as it is described by the people who mockingly defend it, is a spatial temporal creature. Or remember in 1961 when the cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin flew into outer space and famously radioed back, "I don't find God anywhere." Now, of course, he too was mocking, but the point was that he presumed that there is no God because he didn't see a spatial, temporal something or other in the heavens which can be described as God. And if you want to put flying teapots and spaghetti monsters and Yuri Gagarin to one side, one of the favorite arguments that atheists throw against God is this: if everything that exists is created, what created God? And they somehow think that that's a knockdown, clinched argument against God's existence. That surely, if God has been created, there has to be something that created God, and who created that, and who created that, and who created that, ad infinitum. But once again, this misanalogy is messing up thinking properly about God, because God is not an existing thing. God does not exist in space and time, and therefore God is not created, because creation, to come into being, is only predicated of things that exist. So what can we say about God? Well, I think that we are told in perfect terms who and what God is in the book of Exodus. When Moses asks God, "Who do I say is sending me back to Egypt to liberate people?" and God famously responds with the so-called tetragrammaton. God says, "I am that I am. Tell them that who is sending you. I am that I am." And in that particular self-disclosure, God is using verb hacha, to be, twice. God is calling God's self pure being, the ground of being, the foundation of everything that is. God is, to use bad grammar, that I hope makes the point, but God doesn't exist. God is outside of all the temporal and spatial sphere, but is the being that founds it. God bees, God doesn't become. So words matter, my friends, and to misapply words is to automatically set oneself on a course of argumentation that either misses the point or is just going to be sloppy. Atheists are right. God doesn't exist. But then people who believe in God in general, and people like Christians in particular, never said that God does exist. God is. I'm Father Kerry Walters, and this has been another Holy Spirit moment. Thank you so much for watching. God bless. I'll see you soon.